So the first question I wanted to ask is, what does the word intersectionality mean to you?
Intersectionality. I would say if you have a division between two things.
What about race?
Race, I would say, is an ethnicity and a cultural difference between different groups of people.
And when did you first notice almost a level of consciousness about your race in Britain? You grew up in Britain, correct?
That's correct. I think the time I grew up in the UK, it was probably the most apparent when you go to school and you have different individuals of different cultures, and maybe the dominant culture in the UK being Caucasian is when race probably starts impacting you the most, and you as an individual will start to recognise that you are a minority, not a majority.
And when you lived in the UK when you were a child, did you ever experience racism?
Yes, without doubt. Maybe it is overtly, I would say yes, and I would say also at a lower level, subconsciously, there's institutional racism in the UK.
Can you elaborate?
So overtly would be easily a car could drive past and someone could shout, the N-word from a car. From the perspective of institutional racism, I've been to an interview before and been the only person sitting in the interview room and having a name that is predominantly of Scottish descent on the surname and English on the first name. I've sat with a senior firm of accountants for an interview, and the senior partners come out with only me in the interview room and asked to speak to Norman Watson for the next interview, and walk up past me asking for Norman Watson. In that occasion, understandably, I did not get the position.
I suppose 1965 was a big year for the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act in the United States. What parallels do you see between the shift in race relations in the UK and the apparent shift in race relations here in the US?
I think in the US there's been a lot of legislative race relation acts to try and move things forward with reference to trying to give pro rights to ethnic groups. I think the UK, even though there are certain civil rights acts, so to speak, I think the UK has become more of an integrated society by default. And so I think, yes, there are acts in the UK, against anti-discrimination, etc. But I think the society as a whole has become more integrated. And so some of those laws have been less, in my opinion, necessary to influence companies and influence people moving forward with reference to getting into certain positions in certain companies. So I think a lot of it has been, definitely integration of ethnic groups into marriages, helps with a change of mindset, massively integrated schools, but that is dominated in big cities in the UK. Less so if you go out into rural England. That is still dominant Caucasian community. And when I say dominant, I'm talking about, I looked at recent reports up to 99.x white. Whereas certain big cities, the mix, definitely London is a cosmopolitan city and definitely a melting pot of cultures. Whereas if you go out to something like Lake District, you'll find that ethnic mix isn't really there.
And what do you think was the biggest period of change in race relations in the UK?
Biggest period? That's a difficult one. I felt the biggest shift was late 70s going into the 80s, in my opinion. And a lot of that was a cultural shift, and a lot of that was influenced by music in the UK, also the inclusiveness of musical cultures. Definitely black music massively influenced UK culture, fashion, and also sport. I think that became massively integrated. Definitely in the UK, black music massively influenced young people, and that was all ethnic groups.
What kind of artists did you listen to?
There was a lot of ska music came in. It had a lot of Caribbean, almost Jamaican influence behind it. Reggae music came in. Then R&B came in from the US. Rap music came in. That became very popular as influencing sort of young mindsets in young people, and it was fashionable. And even if you look today, there's certain ethnic groups like that are deemed to be trendy. Jamaica's deemed to be trendy now. You'll see almost like different individuals, different people who use almost like Jamaican culture as a part of looking trendy and modern, etc. Whether they've come from that culture or not. So I think that
so it's sort of a reappropriation.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. And at one point, don't forget, people from Caribbean community weren't deemed to be that. Back in the 60s, they were deemed to be hostile, aggressive. Jamaicans definitely were deemed to be hostile and aggressive. British people saw them that way. They were commonly deemed to be muggers. That if you're on the street, that somebody who's a black male of black Jamaican origin is like to mug you. And all of a sudden, the advent of sport, music, and everything, people like Bob Marley, Usain Bolt has made come from that culture, very popular.
I want to understand how you see that transition shaping the society of today then. So obviously there's been an influx of more black politicians, as you said, some of those elements of black culture, so music especially, as well as I'd say in the film and TV industry, have given black youths in Britain and the US more aspirational role models, and there has been a corresponding shift in, I suppose, the way that culture's digested by the population. But do you think that those those are all surface level changes, or do you think that's impacted meaningful societal change for my generation?
I think for young people today of, you know, of a black ethnic culture, I think that definitely those role models exist. I think they can show and prove to young people today you can get to the very top. You know, you someone like Obama becoming president of the US, Kamala Harris running for president as a female, a woman of colour for president of the US, but in the UK, I would say less so for black culture. So if you look at the corporate environment in the UK, there's very few black CEOs of companies. In the FTSE 500 top companies, or 100 companies in the UK, I would say there are a single percentage, and even if they get to a good example, the CEO of John Lewis was a black female woman, came in 2 years ago, is no longer with the company, has now stepped away or been fired from that position. So there's very few role models corporately in the UK. I think there's more in the US that get to the very top. But I would say from an ethnicity, there are certain cultures that are massively progressive in politics and in the corporate environment in the UK, but it's not the black community, it's the Indian community. So if you look at politics in the UK, there's multiple positions that are, you know, people of Asian ethnicity are starting to dominate, and also in the corporate world as well. Less so in the black community, and that's because from a Caribbean perspective, that community has over time also condensed and intermarried, but also in the African community, which is, so if you look at the cultural community in the UK, at the top it's Caucasian, then it's Indian, and then it's African, outside of some Eastern European countries. So if you look at the demographics in the US, it's not that. So, and there are sort of role models in the US, I think, whether that's in politics or in
I want to touch on that though, because do you think that Kamala Harris not being able to succeed is a deterrent for black women in the country who feel that their voices aren't being heard and will continue to be that way?
I believe they will feel that their voices can now be heard. I think she's provided that opportunity. I think she was credible. I think that when she was campaigning, the time she had to put together a viable campaign was very limited. Definitely the way that US politics is sort of structured when running for president. I would still question, is the US open to a female president? So gender, I think, dominates the US, as does race massively. But you know, the fact that Hillary Clinton wasn't elected, the fact that Kamala Harris hasn't been elected, is the US ready for a female president? I would question that more.
Do you think that is damaging?
I think it's damaging for any society. I think all societies have to be open to the best candidate, irrespective of gender and irrespective of colour. And the US looked like they were going down the correct route with Obama, who was massively credible as a president.
And what did you think when Obama was elected?
I thought it was a good thing for the US and a good thing for the world at that point. And now the US seems to become more polarised.
Do you think that's as a result of Obama's successes?
I think it's a result of the undercurrent in the US. I think, like all cultures and societies, you only need the right people at the right time to harness the mindset and the environment of people, and you will actually see ultimately where that society really is. You know, you go back to the 1930s, Hitler did it, Mussolini did it, Trump's done it, and it really shows where that society is when they're tested.
Mm. And I suppose my final question then is, with your children, what do you see as being the biggest obstacles racially that they'll face?
Depends which country they decide to live in. I think ultimately, because their acceptance will be based on the demographics of that society, I think. And I think ultimately they will, I think if you set your children up correctly to understand the way the world's been structured, the history of the world, the history of the world with different cultures, I think they're on the right footing to succeed in any society. I think culturally my children have come from backgrounds whereby their families are multicultural, and so they don't live their colour as a with a mindset of a hindrance to succeed. And I was brought up that way with my parents. I believe my children were brought up that way with their parents. And so I believe they feel they can achieve anything, albeit it doesn't mean it's a level playing field for them. But that will not stop them from getting to where they need to get to. It will just be more difficult. And that, I think, over time is getting easier. But we aren't where we should be, because it should be a level playing field for all.
Great, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me.
You are very welcome.